Pink Floyd were, or maybe still are, a British rock band. So I'm going to do a potted history of Pink Floyd. They're one of the most successful bands in history. Their appeal has been very big amongst the target demographic that's basically me. So if you're in a similar category, you might know quite a bit of this already. Um, so Pink Floyd started in 1965, which was a few years before the official start of progressive rock, which was in 1969. So they had to hang around for a few years waiting for that. But luckily, they had their own shining crazy diamond called Syd Barrett, who fitted in really well with the psychedelic stuff that was going on at the time. And they quickly realised that a recording studio was a kind of playground, so they had a lot of fun with experimental effects and processing and tape loops. Um, Dave Gilmour joined as a guitarist a little while later. Syd Barrett left. Well, left is not really as clear as that. He was kind of left out. And they left him behind. So whether Syd Barrett was actually crazy is something that's debated. He may have had mental health issues. He may have had drug issues. He certainly had some sort of issues. The remaining band members made a lot of mileage out of exploring mental health in some of their songs, particularly later on. And it's been widely assumed that this was about Syd. So Pink Floyd then got back to the serious business of reinventing themselves and waiting for the explosive success of Dark Side of the Moon. So they made several albums with music and experimental studio sounds, and they were generally fairly successful, having a particular relationship with film soundtracks and being somewhat progressive, but on their own terms, which I guess is the right thing to do when you talk about being progressive. They were not above having an organ now and then. They tended away from the mellotron in favour of guitar riffs and spacey synth chords. Fortunately, Dave Gilmour turned out to be a really good guitarist. So, 1973 and Dark Side of the Moon happened, and this was the start of the dominance of Roger Waters, who was their bassist. So this was now peak success time, with follow-up albums Wish You Were Here, Animals and The Wall. Somehow, where other prog rock acts faltered towards the end of the 70s and in the early 80s, Pink Floyd not only survived, but basically conquered the world at this point. Finally, with a sense of finality, they brought out an album called The Final Cut, which Roger Waters thought was the last ever Pink Floyd album, so he left. But it turned out he was wrong. So Dave Gilmour took the reins. And over the next 10 years, they only had 2 studio albums, but they sold so very well worldwide. And their other albums were still selling, and they did a lot of live shows, and they were generally hugely successful in this period as well. So after all that success, I think they were a bit tired out, so they took a break. The modern era has seen the reconciliation of Pink Floyd with Roger Waters. There's been several events and a rather curious final album called The Endless River. So now finally they might have finished. So Dave Gilmour seems to think so. Rick Wright died, so that only leaves Nick Mason, who's the drummer, if he wanted to carry on as Pink Floyd, but I think it's unlikely. Pink Floyd were, especially in the early days, influenced, or there was some influence backwards and forwards. Certainly they were influenced by contemporary classical that was going on, and krautrock may have influenced Pink Floyd, or Pink Floyd may have influenced krautrock. Who really knows? It may be that they were both just going from the same source of the contemporary classical and the minimalists and people like Terry Riley. But they brought these ideas and the interesting developments in music here to a much wider audience. So at this point, assuming that they've finished, their total studio album count is 14. Hi, my name's Dan. So this was Pink Floyd's 4th album, and cards on the table here, I'm a long-time Pink Floyd fan. So I was probably about 15 or 16. Look at me. This is, we're talking 40 years ago when I first heard this album. And it was one of a series or collection of albums that a schoolmate introduced to me as part of a campaign to improve my musical taste. And it very definitely worked. And I used to play one of the tracks on this album called Several Species of Small Furry Animal Gathered Together in a Cave and Grooving with a Pict to anyone who would listen as a benchmark for how weird music could get, and that was a good thing. So I have, nostalgic feelings for this album. Also, I often try, when I'm doing these reviews, to be pretty much out of context and think about what would happen if you listen to this album if you don't understand that, you're not a big kind of into the history and all the stuff that's surrounding it. This is really hard with Pink Floyd because the history is really important in terms of what happened and why, I would say. And also there's, I think there's a lot of people who know quite a lot about Pink Floyd anyway. There's a huge amount being written about them. So, this album came out after Syd Barrett had left, and they were leaving behind the kind of naive psychedelic hippie songs, and into a much more experimental part of their lifetime as a band. It's probably their most experimental album, I would say. It's a double album, so the first two sides, that's the first disc, are live tracks, recorded in fairly small venues, and for the second album, each member of the band, there were 4 members of the band, got half a side, and to do with as they wanted, and they individually went into Abbey Road Studios, it was called EMI Studios then, and treated it as a great big box of toys, and the results are really interesting. So let's deal with the first album first, the live stuff. They were definitely in a kind of space rock place for their live stuff at this point. So long flowing compositions that kind of build up from little bits to big grand epic feels. The kind of soundscape is a word that's often used for this kind of thing, rolling on and big, kind of more like something like Ravel's Bolero, a classical piece, more than a rock song, certainly. And they're not often got words in them. And when they do, there might be whispered phrases like, so the phrase "careful with that axe, Eugene" is in the track, named "Careful with that axe, Eugene." Quite dark in tone, sometimes having experimental sounds in them. As I said, very different from the pop that was around at the time, probably or possibly influenced by krautrock that was emerging at the same sort of time. It might be the influence was the other way. I'm kind of tending to think these days that it was just an interplay between the two. There were certainly elements of the Avant Garde contemporary classical world in here as well. They were starting to work on electronic stuff and experiments in recording. So, the harmonies that are used are mostly straightforward, but there's some odd modes and quite an emphasis on minor keys. And one of these tracks, The Source of All the Secrets, is more experimental than the others, in that it's kind of using more sounds rather than music. So the second disc is kind of, I guess the question is, what do you expect when you let a bunch of creative people in a very experimental mood loose in a studio, and basically there's just lots of strange and weirdness going on here. So sometimes there's an obvious focus on the person's particular instrument, so keyboards, drums, guitar. There's definitely a disregard for convention. There's some of it that kind of seems to be what are the weirdest sounds you can get out of the instruments that you've got in the band, but definitely playing with tape loops and using electronic processing and stuff. If you like experimental music, there's a lot here to really dig into. For me, I've mentioned it before, the highlight is the several species of small furry animal gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pict, which is surprisingly descriptive of what it actually is, and it's almost entirely done vocally by Roger Waters, but using a lot of processing on it. And the pict is hilarious. It's this kind of pseudo, very overdone Scottish thing. You can work out some of the words that is in there. He's basically said it doesn't mean anything, and I believe that, but it's fun. The other of his tracks, interestingly, is very different, which is a really charming kind of naive song going back to some of the really earlier stuff that they did with Syd Barrett, called Grantchester Meadows, which is named after a meadows in Cambridge. I've actually been there. So I'm kind of highlighting those two tracks because they are definitely my favourite tracks on the album, the Roger Waters tracks. But the whole album's just a rush to the head. It's good. I would say. Now, what I don't know is whether I really like it because I was younger when I listened to it and I was more open to experimental music then. So I've definitely heard a lot more experimental stuff whilst I've been doing these reviews. And some I like and some I don't. So I used to think that if stuff was weird, I was going to like it. And now I realise that this is not necessarily the case. I think it comes down to the aesthetics, the particular aesthetics of what's being done. And I definitely like this. The other thing is that I think that puts me off sometimes is if it's weird, but I suspect they're not actually very good at playing their instruments, that will tend to make me react more strongly against it rather than for it. I like it. I think it's a pivotal album. Strangely, the band themselves really don't apparently hate it. They think it's a really bad album. It is true that it is ultimately hugely self-indulgent. But yeah, I think it's a great album. What do you think? Please talk to me through the comments box. That's it from me for now.
But I